By my count, you have 23 days until you need to be in Virginia for the We the People National Finals. Welcome to episode 16 of the Constitution in American Life, where the goal is the Friends of Publius to be able to provide you a help in preparation for that wondrous event. In today's segment, we are asked to address students representing Unit 3 with discussion over the amendment process, the motive and purpose of amendments, and what role, if any, should public sentiment play in shaping the drafting and ratification of amendments to the United States Constitution. It has been almost 53 years since Amendment 26 was proposed, illustrating in my mind the overwhelming difficulty we have as a people and as a nation, changing our higher law to adjust to changing times. Polls show that Americans support some significant changes in the structure dealing with the Senate. They support amendments dealing with some policies, yet I would argue that we have almost no chance for any of that happening because of the structure of amendments, which is, of course, my perspective and possibly my perspective alone on that issue. So continuing with our new lineup, we would like to begin our discussion with Dr. Mike Williams, Professor of Political Science from the University of San Diego. He's sitting outside a Starbucks. I think he's doing some kind of, research there, which is what political scientists do, is they talk to people who are actually alive versus Professor Moore, who doesn't there. So Professor Williams is outside of Starbucks doing some research there on some political question.
He's got office hours. It's office hours.
I didn't get it, but that's okay.
It's like the Bruce Willis movie. He sees dead people. That's Tim's line. I see, but he whispers it. That's why I whispered.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So, Professor Williams, from a theoretical and practical point of view, is there an optimal, a magic
Yes.
line, equilibrium
Totally.
in pricing? We talk about it there. Optimal design for an amendment process somewhere between the Articles of Confederation, all right, and the state of California.
Yeah.
Is there some kind of equilibrium between those two, in your opinion, for an efficient and effective amendment process that keeps the people feeling like they have a role and a say?
Yeah. I want to start off by saying that to all the viewers, this is the last time you'll see me go first, because there's a reason why lineups stay the same. And given my bad joke at the beginning, there's a reason why I couldn't hit a curveball back then. I can't hit one now, and here we go. Yeah, here's my optimal thing.
Yeah, but the 1 out of 10 times you get on base, you're more likely to steal a base than Professor Moore is. So that's why you're there. All right.
True. That is very true. Yeah, I do think I've been thinking about this, the optimal kind of design. Here's what I would propose, some middle ground. I propose that a constitutional amendment needs to pass with, I'm going to go with 65, we can say 66% of both houses of Congress. I think it should start there. I think when it comes out of Congress, I think we have a national vote. And I think that we are looking for the amendment to get 50% or more of the votes in 60% of the states, which would be 30 states. At that point, I don't know how we do this without first changing the Constitution, but I would then have the Supreme Court be able to exercise abstract judicial review and just see if this is not going to work with our Constitution. Many constitutions have limitations on what you can amend. So ideally, I'd like to have the court amend it. But again, that would take an amendment to be like, are there certain things that we just can't amend in our Constitution? But I like the idea of some combination between coming through Congress. I think, it's just not what we think. Empirically, our Constitution, the US Constitution, is the most difficult to amend in the entire world. It's super, super rigid. So I do think it's important to have some kind of combination going through all each and every state, or vast majority of the states. I think is too much. So I'd say 50% in 30 more of the states after it comes through Congress with some sort of judicial sort of review of it after the fact.
But you'd still keep it a supermajority. And just think of this:
Yeah, I would.
if it was 1787 and you were designing an amendment process, you would still keep it a supermajority in both houses.
I would. I think to change the constitution, I think you need more than a majority, but I don't think you need as much as a supermajority as we currently have in our system. So yeah, that's what I would do.
Gentlemen, anything you want to add to Professor Williams' insights about the ideal amendment process?
Well, I mean, at the convention, the Virginia plan, I think the 13th or 14th, it was later in the list of what the Randolph plan was, and it said, you know, in vague terms, that the amendment process should not include the national legislature. That was kind of the basis of their discussion. Now, the sum total of discussion throughout the summer wasn't much, but that was where they started, excluding the national legislature for any amendments. And then they started quibbling about, oh, what about it? What if we had an amendment that abolished slavery? What if we had an amendment that altered the Senate? So we had those clauses added. But I think Mike's proposal starts with the national legislature. So I find that compared to what they were thinking in 87, they didn't want the national legislature involved at all, according to Madison's plan originally.
Chris?
I'm going to go back to a person that Tim has thrown out a couple of times, and that's Alexander Hamilton. And maybe we should just get rid of the state's role in this, because part of the issue here is, you know, I'm going to work off of the numbers from the 2000 census, not the 2020 census, but it was only going to take about 3.8% of the population to say no to an amendment. So you can line up 13 state legislatures to not approve an amendment that represent about what 3.9% of the population that will be able to limit what the rest of the country wants. That is silliness, for lack of, well, I can think of some other words, but I'm going to go with silliness, because we put the power in the hands of the states. And you know, and conversely, you could get you could get 3/4 of the states to ratify the Constitution mathematically that would not represent the majority of people in the country. So the whole, and I was told there'd be no math on this quiz, sorry. But this whole process seems to me to be just silly, that we're going to limit ourselves. But that, again, back to Mike's point, that would have to take an amendment to the amendment process to change it.
Well, yeah, and you're right. But you know, again, from the theoretical view, I'm wondering, especially, and we're going to talk about this in more depth here in a second here, but especially if we buy into the idea, all right, that our system of government, one of the key principles is popular sovereignty. I don't understand why you need the legislative branches at all, and why you can't have a national plebiscite or national referendum, all right, of 2/3. I'll go with a supermajority, Mike, of 2/3 of the people, all right, want this change. And I'll even say back in the 18th century, I understand there would have been some issues, all right, but it's not like you're going to do it overnight. An amendment process is long and difficult as it is there. So, you know, I'm with you, Chris. This whole supermajority, which involves states and the way that states are imbalanced on population, it just looks silly that the way it works out mathematically is, again, it's a tyranny. It's not a tyranny of a majority. It's a tyranny of the minority when it comes to the ability for us to change our higher law there. So, Professor Moore, I've been working with some students here in California, and your insights on the concept of popular sovereignty have kind of ruffled some feathers here, and I've run with it. I love ruffling feathers here. So I am wondering, is the amendment process as it currently exists and has existed, does it affirm the role of popular sovereignty within our constitutional system?
It depends. I think
Okay.
if you say, well, first of all, you've dabbled on the edge of some very significant statements. Well, I'll pose this, and it's rhetorical. If you believe Article 5 is the only way to get an amendment, then I say there's no popular sovereignty, because if there's an amendment using Article 5, you're using an existing framework. You're using a framework that's post-contract. Now, if there's other ways to change the Constitution, and Amar, you're in good company here, David. Amar, John Weil, I think even Bruce Ackerman have proposed that Article 5 isn't the only way that we could get an amendment. I mean, if you want to get to a fundamental document, in a very generalized way, Jefferson says alter or abolish. Now, I know that that's not a constitutional set of statements there, but the principle is, if people are mad enough, you wouldn't have to limit yourself to Article 5. And then if you're not limiting yourself to Article 5, then I say that's popular sovereignty. But if you're using the structure that was set up at Philadelphia to amend it, I'm not sure that, according to my definition of popular sovereignty, which is making the system, not policy under the system. So I think it depends on whether you think Article 5 is the only way. And I would urge students to really delve into Akhil Amar, some of his stuff, and Sandy Levinson is another that's proposed, that we've got some other things not bound by the text of the Constitution that might be ways to amend. And also, I'll hold off on some comments about the judiciary and decision making there. But I mean, that's my point. If you say it's only Article 5, no. If there's other things, yes.
Wait, if it's a structural amendment, and therefore we are creating an addendum to our structure, i.e. the 12th Amendment or the 20th Amendment or the 23rd Amendment, those structural elements there, all right? From what I understood, your previous view is that popular sovereignty only exists in the creation of constitutions.
Yes.
We, the people, do ordain. We created this, but it's not in a policy kind of thing or popular sovereignty. So isn't an amendment process, if it deals with a structural issue, isn't that popular sovereignty?
And I'm willing to concede that that's a very valid argument. All I'm saying is, using the system to add to or subtract, in a couple of our cases, subtract from the structure, isn't popular sovereignty. It's tinkering with the policy making under the Constitution. So I'm pushing the envelope here, because really what I would hope is for students really to think about, is Article 5 the only way? And I think there's a lot of scholarship to back up this idea that we're not limited to Article 5.
Yeah, I've been watching Professor Kavanaugh's face during your articulation, and it's amazing journey through the contortions of his face here. So Chris, you wanna express yourself verbally on
this? Yeah. Okay. So when do you mean when we're talking about the amendment process, that is the amendment process in Article 5. Now, if you're talking about constitutional interpretation, constitutional application, constitutional, and this is what Amar, and this is what Levinson, and this is what these guys are talking about. So, you were almost sounding like a political scientist there, because you're talking about these different categories and these different theories, right?
I know. I'm going to have to go shower right away afterwards. So.
So, I mean, and for the students, I don't want the students to get caught up in this. This is not just semantics, but it is important. So you're asked to deal with the amendment process, not necessarily the Constitution's application or interpretation. And I think that's where Professor Moore is really talking about. So understand the differences here between what he's talking about in this political theory and versus what you may be wrestling with in terms of.
Well, but I'm willing to concede that if we want to blow up our Constitution, we don't need Article 5 to do that. Now that's a dangerous thing. That's a dangerous thing, but I'm willing to concede within our tradition, that's within the realm of possibilities.
Well, I mean, and so are you talking about Locke's right to revolution? Are you talking about, Jefferson's alter and abolish?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, the abolish piece,
Yeah.
or even alter. Yeah. Both.
Yeah. I mean,
Mike?
we'll just call it January 6th.
We could.
Okay.
So Tim, are you envisioning this through nonviolent means? I mean, like after the next election, whoever loses, if the other candidate, all those states that they carry, they just they get together, they hold individual conventions and say, we're done. Are you saying that's a way to?
I'm saying that's a way it could be done, and I'm saying that's a really crappy way and a dangerous way. But I mean, I find irony in January 6th because they wanted to use the system. Supposedly use that system. Now there's an irony in that. But if they were really serious, they wouldn't have used the system. This is scary, but I don't think we should limit. There are certain problems with limiting yourself to textualism for constitutional alteration or abolishing.
So I am curious, Professor Moore, and actually it's to all three of you, if you want to jump in. There are two procedures within Article 5, two different pathways. And it is my understanding, could be wrong here, that we've only used one of those pathways, all right, for 26, I guess, of the 27 amendments, or is it all 27? And I'm wondering, why is that? Why is that we've only used the one where it goes to the legislature, comes out of the legislature, goes to the states there, and not the other one where it's state conventions? What are your thoughts?
I would say that it's that process is largely beholden to communications. I think it's entirely possible in the future, because of the speed of which we can talk, that states will be able to get together and do it from a bottom up much more efficiently and quickly than they may have in the past. And I see that as a technology piece.
Chris, any thoughts on why the one predominates?
Yeah, because I think the idea is if and this is one of Madison's fears, is the second convention, right? So when you start going to these conventions at the state where you may be meeting to, okay, we're going to propose a balanced budget amendment. But when, the idea that how can you limit a state convention to stick to one topic? Because if you're talking about making structural changes to the document, or in addition, an addendum to the document, or whatever you may be talking about from that state level, you're opening up a can of worms, I think, that could be tough to control.
I agree with that. Yeah, I also think it has to do with as hard as it is, it's easier to get the two houses of the federal government together to decide this is the language of the amendment and let's send it. If it starts at the states, like let's say the state of Arkansas says, we're going to pass this language for a constitutional amendment, and the next up is going to be the state of Kansas. Well, they're going to have to take that. It's going to have to be the same exact language. And I just think, given our federal system and given how much this is what lawmakers like to do, they like to tinker over these words, it's just going to be a harder process to sort of get going, because you're going to have so much agreement on the same text coming out of each of the legislatures at the state level.
I mean, that was the argument against the second convention back in ratification, that very thing. It would never end in the verbiage that would spill out trying to do this. Exactly.
But to push back a little bit, and maybe just to throw a monkey wrench in, we have organizations like ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which we know they're very active at the state level, and we see legislation happening at the state level that almost is verbatim because it's put out by this special interest group. Mm-hmm. So they may be able to say, okay, here you go, states, here's your new amendment, and everybody just rubber stamp it through your legislature, and we can get the requisite number of states, no problem, which might represent less than 50% of the people.
Well,
So,
I mean, again, I would agree with you. It seems to that it seems that we are in a world now where it would be much easier with communication and technology to get 37 states to agree to a convention. In fact, if I'm correct, I believe there is a movement to do such a thing, and it has something like 15 to 20 states so far. They're still a distance away, but we're seeing again that ability to centralize language and to agree to certain things much easier today than at any time. And looking back on history, Chris, what I noticed in looking at our amendments is they seem to come in bursts. Of course, we've got the first 10 in 1791. Then we have 3 between the periods 1865 to 1870, 4 between 1913 and 1920, and 4 between 1961 to 71. Why is that? What analysis can you provide us on what's that pattern?
well, I would throw 11 and 12 into the founding era. Because we have those laws of unintended consequences. See the 12th Amendment. We have a Supreme Court case, Chisholm versus Georgia. See the 11th Amendment. About states being able to sue other states, people being able to sue other states, and so we have a Supreme Court case, Chisholm versus Georgia. Oh, we didn't think about that, so there's the 11th Amendment. Obviously, we have the election of 1800, and that gets a little messy, and that gets a little sloppy, and we didn't think about that. Maybe we should change that. Excuse me, I apologize. And so I would throw 11 and 12 into the founding era. Clearly, the Reconstruction Amendments, the Civil War amendments, I mean, those are, I think, some of I'm in my mind, the most important amendments to the Constitution if you had to single them out. But we went through a national crisis, and we needed to make some serious changes in one relationship to a Supreme Court decision in Dred Scott, right? We had to make sure that we finally put in the document that slavery was technically illegal except for punishment for a crime. So we know that that's still, people worked their way around that to a degree. So then you get into the blowback from the populist movement, where you get this progressive movement. I always like to think of history in this pendulum swinging, and then there's a pushback against that swing. And so you go through this the Gilded Age and this unbridled capitalism that we see, and this concentration of wealth, and you start to see the progressive idea of pushing back that, you know what, an income tax is okay. Perhaps this state legislatures electing senators, too much corruption. Well, I know we've talked about that on previous episodes, and you start to see that there's that outlier, the 18th. I think we'll talk about that in a bit. But then we think about that women should get the right to vote. So I think you see these in relationship to the events in society, and we're able to respond to those events in society by changing our document.
So go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, that's right. Go ahead.
Well, so you would agree with me. It seems to me that of those 4 bursts, that 3 of those are responding to societal change, and one of those is forcing societal change, and that would be the Reconstruction period. The Reconstruction period is forcing something, whereas the other 3, to me, are responding to changes that are already being demanded. Would you agree with me on that?
Well, I'm going to change it up a little bit. I would say the Reconstruction Amendments are an attempt to reform.
Yeah.
But I would say that we dropped the ball on that. With that Reconstruction eventually truly will be a failure because we have the ability to do it, but we don't follow through because of the election of 1877.
Well, and because it is top down. If we look at the nation as a whole, because the southern states, they're forced to ratify if they want to be back in the union. So that's hard to say that that's a response to the societal changes being demanded. To me, it's top down, therefore it's kind of being forced on society for good, very good reason. I think we would all agree to that. But in order for that to stick, that enforcement has to stick, and
Yeah,
it didn't.
yes. And the
And it
enforcement
didn't.
does not stick. Yes, it
Right,
doesn't
but the
stick.
the other three are again, those are driven by societal changes already, i.e. the first 10 are, hey, this is the agreement by the people through the anti-federalists and the compromise. All right, progressive, the people are pushing for this. That's not a top-down thing, I don't think. The
No.
civil rights period. So
Well,
I
and
see.
I think the last, you know, the 22nd through the 26th are interesting to take a look at in themselves. I mean, obviously, the 22nd Amendment is a result of FDR. And with the irony, because the Republicans are going to push this through, and because of the fear of you know, another FDR, and Eisenhower probably could have won a third term, but he was bound then by the amendment. You take a look at the 23rd. The 23rd Amendment is an extension of voting rights to people in D.C. They should get some representation, right? And the 24th is a continuation of the civil rights movement and outlawing the poll tax. So I think you start to see that. You get into the 25th Amendment, presidential succession. We have that as a result of, well, gosh, we've had a guy assassinated. We've had a vice president resign. And so, you know, well, with the vice president hadn't resigned yet, we've had an assassination. We have to figure out this line of succession. So, because that was not clear. You know, 26th Amendment, we're finally going to get into this idea of like, if we're going to draft these young people, maybe we should allow them to vote. And that also, too, also the 26th, in response to a Supreme Court decision, Oregon versus Mitchell.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, you see the Congress and legislative bodies responding to Supreme Court decisions in many of these. And of course, the 27th itself is a story, as one of Madison's, as I'm sure
right.
students know,
Yeah,
one of Madison's originals.
right. Tim?
Yeah, I have two thoughts. Chris used fear. He used the word fear. And I think that's important. Yeah, the first 10 amendments is driven totally by fear. If you ask Madison, I don't want a second convention. So I think there's this fear, if we don't do something, bad crap happens. Now the Civil War amendments, I think if we put a noble gloss on the Civil War amendments, it's an attempt to restructure society or the constitutional system at a minimum. You know, in the progressive era, I think there's a fear there if we don't act. So I think the fear piece, it might be important that Chris has raised, that might drive. And then, and you know, and I also, the other thought I had was, this is a lot like evolution. You've got this in the evolutionary theory, you've got these punctuated moments where there's tremendous change in a short period of time, like a million years rather than 10 million. But so I wonder whether the constitutional evolution that we've had has these punctuated moments where tremendous change takes place, coupled with fear. So I think I like this question, David. This crisis. I think you asked it in terms of crisis, and Chris just used the F word, fear. I think that's important.
Well, and again, like I said, to me, in a simpler model, the question is implying either a top-down or bottom-up motivation, and then maybe there's sometimes it's actually a combination of both.
Yeah.
But I kind of like that idea that that especially in these periods of bursts where we see a lot of amendments or numerous amendments within a relatively short period of time, that fear may be at the root. Fear by the government of the unruly masses in some way. Mike, did you have a thought on that?
No, my only comment is, I think students, it'd be good for you to think about this idea of fear, and especially around I think the progressive amendments, to ask, political elites need to feel like if they don't respond, their jobs are on the line. So I think it'd be interesting to look at that period and to just think about, okay, why is it at that period these political elites are feeling that way? I think with the first 10 or 12, and I think the Civil War, I think it's a different dynamic going on. But I think the progressive period is really interesting because I do think it was fear, but it was also the elites were responsive. Um, I think with public opinion polls we have, there's consensus on some constitutional amendments, but I don't think there's a fear that people are really gonna punish lawmakers for it. But imagine a group getting together, kind of like this uncommitted movement right now for Biden. What if a group of voters come out and they just say, we're simply going to boycott an election until we get rid of the electoral college, all parties, right? We just are, we're going to change the electoral game. I bet you if they were serious and they showed that through an election cycle, I bet you that fear might get political elites to act in a way that they haven't. So the politics of that in that progressive period, I think, is really interesting for students to look at.
You sure that's Starbucks you're at, Mike, and not some place that maybe serves something a little stronger? Because I'm not. I don't think that I would see the political elites responding that way
Today or during the progressive period?
No,
It'd take more than one election cycle, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, right. And you know, I forgot too about the 16th Amendment is a response to a Supreme Court decision in Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust Company.
Yeah.
Which said they limited Congress's ability to the idea of an income tax. So, but I think, but maybe Mike, I don't know. I wish that that could happen to get rid of the Electoral College, but I don't see that happening.
Well, that's a good transition to Professor Moore here, because it seems to me that one of the the costs or the consequences of this difficult amendment process is that culturally the people have looked to the courts and the Supreme Court to play a much more significant role in changing the understanding and meaning of the Constitution. Would you agree with me on that, that's been one of the consequences?
I do, and that's the Sanford Levinson question that you've just asked. He basically says, and I've been thinking about this for a couple days. He might be right. That, is there really a difference? Is there really a difference between major judicial decisions and amendments? And he proposes, and Lochner. Okay, so Lochner decision comes along, and they kind of say, well, a contract, liberty equals liberty of contract. Well, holy cow! I mean, that's pretty dang close to adding stuff to the Constitution, don't you think? You have Santa Clara County. Chris mentioned this a couple episodes ago. When the court says, corporations equal people, students, that's not like a new thing. Santa Clara County was 1880s or somewhere in there. And so is that an amendment to the Constitution by saying corporations get the rights, 14th Amendment rights as people, and therefore can't be regulated? You've got McCullough. Oh, for heaven's sakes, McCullough. Bank is kind of an elaboration of commerce, or Gibbons. Steamboat tickets equal commerce. So, these major decisions, I think Levinson's onto something. And this is all before we got all, jiggy about judicial activism. So I think there is something to this notion that the court, through these major, maybe Marbury is the biggest amendment to the Constitution, frankly, but these decisions could be kind of configured as amendments because they're so landmarkish, if you want to see them as wonderful. So I think Levinson's onto something here, that judicial decisions could be a way to amend our system. And my thinking has always been we have an evolutionary system, so I'm not wedded to Article 5 at a theoretical level. So I think I would agree with your question, David.
Well, so given that, some would argue, myself included, that the courts, the federal courts and the Supreme Court was not set up to play that role, that we are now in a period in which we are seeing some severe consequences of that fact, that we have turned to the courts for that, and that there is blowback. Would you agree with me on that?
One man's activism is another man's, restraint. So, yeah, I think, I did a lot of reading on the court, probably 25, 30 years ago, and I was struck by that notion that, I think a lot of this activism and power of the courts is overblown rhetoric, because I think it's in a sense baked into our system, and I think Levinson's pointing that out. It's been there, and the power, and that means the anti-federalist Brutus was right. The power of that court, given equity, the equity powers, is there. Now, the better question is, do we want it to remain so? Are we comfortable with that? So I think Levinson's onto something here, as seeing interpretation can be amendment.
Chris?
Judicial activism is what the losers call it, to a degree. And unless you're talking about Lochner, then that's just a bad opinion. Of course, my viewpoint, I would be on the losing end. So Amar has a book called America's Unwritten Constitution, which is very interesting, similar to this idea, the things that we have taken into account, and it's a great exercise in that book. Ask your students to pick out the 5 documents or the 5 writings that have become part of our constitutional thinking, if you will, not necessarily part of our constitution, but part of our constitutional thinking. And that's a really interesting idea. And I think we had a previous program where we talked about ballot initiative and initiative, referendum, and recall. And I think, David, you made the point that we end up with this because we have legislatures that perhaps maybe don't want to get their hands dirty. And I think we have the same issue today, where we may not need amendments per se. We just maybe need more statutory types of guidance, but we've got legislative bodies not willing to do that. So they're willing to let the courts figure it out, because we have lawmakers that aren't willing to take to legislate, to make laws, not necessarily amendments. And so we're going to let the courts interpret it based upon what are we basing this stuff on? We're basing this stuff on things written, this process written by these old dead white enslavers who had these viewpoints that were so contrary to where we are today as a society, but we're going to be beholden to that for whatever reason.
Mike, any thoughts on the courts? No? Okay, so.
Well, I would add this. On a previous episode, we talked about ideal representation. I don't recall any of us saying ideal representation is to let the courts decide. So I agree with everything that's been said, and I don't necessarily, like Tim, I don't necessarily have a huge issue with it, because I do believe in an evolutionary system. But my goodness, it seems like that's not how we think of what our representative institutions should be doing.
So, Chris, I think a case study as far as the role of the people is the 18th Amendment and the 21st Amendment, because the kids are asked to assess, the public sentiment and the role of the people's ideas in this drafting and ratification. What do you take away from the 18th and 21st Amendments? What's your historical analysis?
Well, who are these people you were referring to, David? These people we keep talking about. So yeah, I'm joking. Yeah,
I know.
So yeah, well, to me, in a way, I think it shows that that system actually works and it's responsive. It's responsive to the people. I think that's what the framers intended. So, I mean, yeah, the passion at the time, the demon rum is, you had these groups, think about, well, gosh, Carrie Nation and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and what they saw alcohol doing to the family and doing to all kinds of things. And so, they're getting politicians on their side, and they're swaying people. And so the 18th Amendment is ratified, and that's coming out of that progressive era as well, at the tail end of that progressive era.
Yeah.
So it's responding to what the people wanted. It went through the process, and then we go through this experiment of legislating morality, which really the 18th Amendment was an attempt to do. And we found out we're not as moral as we thought we were. And, let's just go ahead and let's put booze back on the
Would you
ballot.
say the same thing about the 26th, Chris?
In terms of,
Was that a fit of passion that the Vietnam, because I mean, you look at the voting numbers, right? It doesn't bear out that was a great triumph either.
right, right, right. And, I think, again, though, I think if you take a look at Oregon versus Mitchell and the response to that about Congress having the authority to go into states to say, okay, this is what the voting, the voting age, Congress doesn't have that authority. How are we going to get Congress that authority? We're going to go back in and we're going to ratify. And I think that comes back. And I think the 18th Amendment and the 21st Amendment, as well as the 26th, goes back to what we talked about earlier. And Tim, what you played up is that fear of elected lawmakers worried about the drumbeats in society. And so the 18th Amendment, you have these drumbeats at the tail end of the progressive era. You have some very connected groups of folks. Even though the 19th Amendment itself hadn't been ratified yet, you still have women voting at state levels already, and especially in Western states. So you start to see this, and people respond to that 18th Amendment. And again, holy cow! You guys understand the history of the wets versus the dries, and the campaigning that went into both sides of this issue. And I don't know the numbers though on how in terms of the 18th Amendment's ratification, if it was overwhelming or if it squeaked by. I don't know that. But I know that for about 13 years, we had this experiment in legislating morality, and we thought, it's not working.
Well, first of all, I think all law is in some way, shape, or form legislating morality. But what it teaches me is that the Madisonian founder's view of people and their nature was absolutely on target, that we are fickle, that we change our minds fairly quickly, that we're not fixed. I mean, I look at this within historic time, that's very brief. Oh yeah, let's do this. Oh my gosh, we didn't think about the unintended consequences of this. We didn't think it through. All right, even though this movement had been around for decades, we never thought it through. And then boom, oh, let's reverse ourselves. I mean, I think about, as far as this fickleness of the people and why, in some ways, I do appreciate our representative constitutional system, and where it tries to kind of slow things down to get people to think about things, is I look at the Affordable Care Act. I mean, we remember what happened in 2010 because of the Affordable Care Act. It leads to a slaughter in the midterm elections of the Democratic Party, and the approval rating of Barack Obama, all right, going down into the 30s. What's the view of the Affordable Care Act today? 60-something% approve of the Affordable Care Act. And in historic time, this is not a long time that has passed. We are fairly fickle. That's what the 18th and 21st Amendment, situation kind of, teaches me to some degree. Yeah, Chris.
One of the things about the 18th Amendment, understand you had a coming together of various, public interest, various interest groups, whether it be progressive, suffragists, populists, nativists, white Southern groups. I mean, there's some racism baked into the cake of the 18th Amendment, right? The bigotry against certain groups,
classism and racism.
Oh yeah, for sure. So that's in that fight, in that fight as well. So I just want to throw that in there for the students, make sure you're taking a look at that driving forces behind the 18th. But you're right, David, we are fickle. But I think you're talking about the Affordable Care Act. That makes me think of the National Bank. I mean, Madison, who was opposed to the National Bank as president, then goes ahead and re-ups it because you know what, the people are happy with it. So
he's an ideal representative. So keep that in mind.
He's a little short, soft-spoken, but he wouldn't come across well on television these days.
They'd have to get the Queen's like that step stool, right?
Yeah.
There's
some short numbers at Congress today too. So I want to turn to Mike, because I've been watching Mike for like the last 15 minutes, and I know he's in a public venue, And for some reason, he reminds me of Tippi Hedren in the movie The Birds, because he keeps looking around like it feels like the birds are landing and they're all looking at him, and he's getting nervous there. So, Professor Williams, is the amendment process, in your opinion, that's drafted and adopted in 1788, 89, is it a counter-revolutionary movement amongst the framers?
I mean, I have something to say on this, and then Tim and Chris, you can tell me if I'm on the right track. I think it is. I mean, I think we've talked on this program before how the Constitution itself is a counter-revolutionary document compared to the Declaration and to some extent the Articles. And I think, yeah, the amendment process is even more of that inside the document. We know that this is Madison, something Madison really, really believed in. He really believed that the Constitution should be rigid, that it's something that there should be a culture of adherence to the document. We sometimes on this show have made fun of the fact of how much reverence we have in the Constitution and the fact how we view it. You can go to Washington, D.C. and see it, and it's like you're entering a church. That's all part of what Madison, at the earlier part of his career, that's the way he thought. So yeah, I do think it's counter-revolutionary. It's different. There's no other country in the world that has created a constitutional process as tough as ours, right? There's a wide spectrum of how countries do it, but we have the toughest constitution to amend.
Well, let me ask you this way: from that comparative perspective,
Yeah.
is the way countries design their amendment process from a political science viewpoint a reflection of their culture? Because you said you agree with our process of supermajorities in the representative bodies, which I'll be honest, surprised me. Which just tells me that you've bought into American political culture, and I'm wondering if other nations around the world, if that's also true, that their amendment process reflects kind of a political culture.
Yes. I mean, the United Kingdom, which doesn't have a written constitution, they can basically change their constitution with a majority vote, right? Very few countries have that. Most countries have some sort of supermajority. I think it's with this instinct that to change the structure of government, you need more than 50%. Part of our culture that is different than most other places, functional democracies, is our federal system, really. I mean, the Germans are what come closest to this idea of letting things having to go through both the national government and their landers, their provincial governments. That's really where we get it from. Most other countries in the world don't have the type of federal system we have, but most of them do require some sort of supermajority to get it done.
I have two thoughts. Number one, I'm going to go with Gordon Wood on this. I think I'm in solid ground here with Gordon Wood. He coined this phrase. You're poking us a little bit, Dave, with this counter-revolution question, which is what we appreciate about you. But I'm going to push back a little bit, and in my corner, weighing in this corner, is Gordon Wood. He calls it institutionalized revolution, the amendment process.
Yeah.
In other words, it's been, I guess if I'm going to put words in his mouth, it's kind of been tamed. That if we want these punctuated moments of change, these amendments, that it's been institutionalized through Article 5. So I guess the word counter-revolution kind of got my dander up a little bit on that. But the other thought I have is these cats knew. I mean, Mason said at the convention, this is an imperfect document. We'd better firm up our discussions about the amendment process. I think that's like September 10. That's real late. And in Washington, by February of '88, is writing friends, and he's saying this. We know that this is an imperfect system. Gee, I'm glad we have Article 5. So, is it counter-revolutionary? I'm going to push back a bit and say that might have been a little overheated there.
Well, I'm gonna say, first of all, I agree with I think the Constitution itself, relative to the revolution is counter-revolutionary. But I guess when I think about amendment, is the amendment process of 1789 more difficult or easier than the amendment process of the Confederation Congress?
Much easier, much
So that-
easier. And that's
so-
that's why those Southerners at the convention were like, whoa, we got to have an 1808. You know, we can't mess with the representation in the Senate. Absolutely. They were afraid of how easy it was. And that's
Okay.
a part of the Federalist argument. If, you know, this is going to be easy if we need to.
Which, and I think that undermines my counter-revolutionary argument about amendment process, whereas I think the Constitution itself. So,
Yeah.
gentlemen, we've come to the end of this program, and we also want to. Mike's looking more and more afraid every second I look at him there. So we want to give him a chance to run away from whatever is haunting him right here. And so, final thoughts, recommendations about this Unit 3 question for students and teachers. And Professor Williams, we'll start with you here. What do you think? What do you have for the kids?
Yeah, I think I would encourage the students to really dig into this idea of fear or chaos, or this idea of, if we don't hurry and do something, the whole system's gonna it's gonna come apart, right? And to ask yourselves whether that resonates just with what you know about human nature. I mean, is that the way we treat a lot of our relationships and a lot of our things at work and at school? Is it just the kind of the way we do things? And then to think through, if your principle were to like make the amendment process so it wasn't responsive to chaos or to this fear of complete disruption, what would be the principles of amendment process to get through that? Like, would there be something in particular you would want to do to make sure we're not writing amendments at a time when we're the most scared as a body politic? I don't know what that would be. I would just have you think through that.
Thank you, Professor Kavanaugh.
I think it's going back to Tim's original thing about constitutional change versus amending the Constitution. Understand that we've gone through many periods of constitutional change without amending the Constitution, and partly because we've allowed the courts to take that much more power in interpreting the document. But again, I mean, I was just listening to a book, and you know, the whole concept that we're tied to these ideas by these guys, and we're limiting ourselves because of this, and not responsive to what the people want, is really kind of silly, to use the word I used earlier. Because again, when you look at the math and how the math lines up for whether to change the document or not change the document, it seems kind of silly to be able to do this or to not be able to do this depending on that. So I'm not sure what kind of ideas you might be able to come up with. But again, think about, if you're not happy with the system, how will we change it? And you know, of course, that would take an amendment to the amendment process, which might be very difficult. And I would think about this too. Will the Constitution ever be amended again through the Article 5 process? And if so, if you think it can happen, how can it happen, and what would the amendment be? And I don't see it in our foreseeable future where we are it being amended. Excuse me. So I would think about that.
Professor Moore.
Yeah, 2 books. One book is a great overview of history. The author is George Anastopoulos. It's really a good book to get a flavor for all the historical background of each of the amendments. Another
What was the
book,
title, Tim? What was the title?
Amendments to the Constitution. I'll put it in the sources. Another one, which I think teachers, every teacher should have this book. It's edited by Sandy Levinson. Responding to Imperfection. There's about a dozen essays in here, very provocative essays about this. And there's like a fair amount of scholars that are like, yeah, let's go beyond Article 5. This is a fantastic book, and again, we'll put that in the resources. But teachers, really, I would recommend those 2 books, and it'll really help your thinking in communicating to students about the Constitution, but beyond the Constitution as well.
So My final thoughts,
Dave,
recommendations.
I'm sorry. David, I'm sorry. I just thought about this too, and I'm going to play my Dave Richmond card here. When in the last bullet, what are the enduring principles they refer to? So might consider that. Sorry.
Nope, that's good. That's good. I'm glad you threw that in. What I'd like to suggest is that, yeah, this is a constitutional process, but if you're an Aristotelian, everything is political. And so these amendments take a political process. I highly suggest, I don't know if you need to do it for all 17 amendments proposed and ratified, since the original 10, but, 4 or 5 of the key amendments, I think, like the 18th, amendment, and like the 19th and maybe the 24th, again, but have some in-depth understanding of the politics of getting that amendment out there and ratified. And that's the book that Professor Moore is showing you. So hopefully we've brought you some perspective and insight that will assist you in about 23 days. Please let your Unit 4 colleagues know that we'll be dealing with who is the ideal legislator? How do they balance the competing interests as they hold that office? We'll be doing that in our next segment. Until then, peace, love, yogurt tacos. Bye-bye, bye-bye.